I have a bunch of ACI fabrics. In this case, I have 3 of them. So I have 3 sites. I have the Newark site, I have site 1 and site 2, not to be characterized to any particular location, right? So in ACI, one of the things that is a primary sort of metric that is generated by the system, by the APIC, is this thing called health score. So health score is something that essentially ACI, the APIC, basically determines a score for a particular resource. Could be the entire fabric, could be a specific switch, could be a specific application. You'll see health scores all throughout ACI, right? And essentially, it's a very simple concept. 100 is good. Less than 100 is not so great, right? So if you look at my chart here, I sort of have the, like if you're less than 79, you're probably not great. You're minor, right? And then if you're less than 49, major, and you're critical if you're less than 29, right? Sort of our take on the health score. So essentially, the APIC calculates this and maintains this health score for all of these different objects, these software-defined objects within ACI, right? So essentially what we're doing is we're collecting that metric and then showing that data over time. So from an overall fabric perspective, I can now show and say, okay, right now, over the past 7 days, yeah, this has only been a 58. It's not great, right? And there's reasons for that, faults and stuff like that you can drill into. But the bigger thing here is to sort of understand from a high level, hey, I've got 3 fabrics. How are they doing? Okay, at the high level health level. So, but maybe I want to know more. So let's look at the switches. And again, I'm looking across all of the fabrics that I'm managing, not just one fabric. So again, this is that I have multiple data centers. I want to see everything, and I want to see it in association with each other. So here you can see these are all the switches associated with the with all of the fabrics that are here. Again, it's a lab, it's not a big environment. So I've got spine switches, leaf switches for different fabrics. And then I can look at that data over time to see if it's changed and baselines and things like that. So again, I'm looking at health score as sort of a primary driver here of not necessarily what is the health score, but has it changed? Has it gone down? Right? So that's an indicator that something has changed in the environment, maybe something that needs to be looked at. And we can look at that stuff over time. So I have past 7 days up here again using DI. I can essentially say, yeah, I just have to look at the last 24 hours. Isn't going to change this graph very much because this is a pretty static environment, but you get sort of the idea that I can very quickly pivot to, different time frames and look at these values over that time, right? So again, we're at the very highest level. So I want to find out, what does ACI think about the health of my switches? Maybe I want to figure out what's going on with this leaf 2 because, it seems like he's not scoring real well. Not really sure why that is, but okay, but we have that visibility, right? The next thing, and this is going to pivot into the software-defined side. So switches are very physical things, right? Tenants are the sort of the top layer of the software-defined side. So a tenant essentially is a group of applications, software-defined applications on ACI. So you can see here I've got things like, tenant production and the pure tenant and, this thing. Again, it's a lab environment. And I have health scores associated with all these things. Some are obviously not great. Some are pretty good, right? So again, if you look at a customer environment, you're going to say, depending on what their application, how their applications are laid out and grouped into tenants, you're going to be able to look at the very highest level and say, well, here across all of my things, here are all the health scores of that. And maybe there's tenants that cross between different fabrics. So you're going to be able to see that at the very highest level. So we took this one step further and said, well, tenants are groups of applications. Well, let's look at the apps because that's what people really care about are the specific apps, right? So, again, my vManage app, my production app, like what are the health scores? Are there any indicators here and what's happening over time with those health scores? So again, you can't get this data any other way other than asking the API for it and then storing it over time. So that's physical to logical. Let's pivot into, you know, the thing that we get all the data from is the APIC, right? So we talked about these things. Is there's an APIC. There's typically 3 in a production environment. There could be 5, there could be 7. In little labs like ours, there's 1 for each site, and this guy's got 3. So the APIC's a really important component because that's where we get our data from. Without that, we can't really show you all the cool stuff, right? So it has a health score. It has other statuses associated with it that we can collect data on, whether it's things are in or out of service, and we can see that data over time. We can see its operational state. So if one of the APICs goes offline, we would be able to see that here. And again, any metric I show you here, we can trigger alerts on and do cool stuff like that, right? There's also a mode where I can say, well, hey, I don't understand, why is that? Oh, okay, maybe this one APIC is in standby mode because he's a hot standby. He's not actually an active node. So I can understand what's going on with that. You know, some more important stuff is, hey, oh, it's in failover state. What state is it in? Maybe it's failing over and it's getting ready to rejoin the cluster, right? So understanding the status of the APICs, which are really the brains of ACI. So once the policies are deployed to the switches, things will run with ACI, but you can't really control the environment and make changes without the APIC. So they're a really important component that we want to make sure that we keep track of. So, and be able to understand that over time. So like I said, at any of these things, we can trigger alerts on what's normal, what's not normal, that kind of stuff. So, you know, the typical SDN type of things, you know, where we would be able to trigger stuff based on metrics, something not being normal, that kind of stuff. And I apologize, my system's a little slow here. Could be my VPN. So while this is loading, let's talk about, oh, here we go. So the other interesting piece about ACI is there's all these different capacity things that are part of ACI. So depending on the number of switches that you have in your fabric, there are certain limits to the amount of tenants that you can have, the number of bridge domains, which are essentially your layer 2 network definitions, your endpoint groups, which are essentially groups of machines, et cetera, right? Endpoints. So there are fabric level capacity limitations based on the size of your fabric. So these numbers will change. So again, if you added a new, like 10 new leaf switches, potentially your fabric size could go up, that these numbers could change the percentage wise. So some of these things make sense from a capacity perspective, but then I also may want to look at them just by account. Like how many tenants do I have in the new Arc pod, right? In that particular fabric or these other fabrics, right? So again, these are more time series metrics that we're collecting. So if something is changing, we can understand this. These are at the fabric level. We also have capacity and collecting capacity at the switch level. So again, really important things like the CAM, which is the memory utilization of the switch. Yeah, there's definitely limits there. So depending on how many policies you've pushed out, that could push your CAM utilization up. You would want to know that so that you could go and address that. So again, that's where we're keeping track of that information. So this is done as a percentage, but then obviously we can do that more as a counter where it makes sense, right? So number of MAC addresses, VLANs, et cetera, there are limitations there. So, you know, from a policy perspective, you may have, you know, a particular application deployed and it's using a specific set of leaf switches, and you want to change that so it's using a different physical set. This would where essentially you would say, yeah, I need to change around the way that some of these things are configured because I'm too close on capacity on some of the leaf switches and things like that. So another really important part of ACI is understanding these. And again, from the perspective of a capacity person, maybe you don't want him in the APIC him or her looking at this thing. We could pull this information out. So now this is available to report externally to having to be inside of the ACI controller and looking at this data. And plus we get it over time and things like that. So, And then, we throw some high level statistics here on like, hey, what ports are passing the most traffic on what fabrics, right? So again, just some more interesting high level. We haven't really dug into the lower level stuff yet, but we'll drill down in a second. So typically ACI keeps track of stuff based on ingress and egress, separate metrics. So we keep track of that. And then this last panel. So when I showed you these guys before, there's a lot of graphs here. So this gets into this whole idea of specific visualizations for solutions. So what you saw before was a typical, performance management graph in SevOne Data Insight. This is a widget that was specifically designed to work with the ACI data, the ACI solution data. The reason it's not available yet is that it typically before only worked with a single fabric, but now, as you can see, it actually is smart enough now to go, oh wait, you have 3 fabrics selected here. Let me give you the info, that roll-up info about all of the things that you saw before. So, and we can color code these and do other neat stuff. You can see we still have some development challenges here because I don't know what fabric it's talking about here. So this is still being worked out, which is why it's not been released yet. But just to give you an idea of how we're improving this view. So essentially, to me, what I see on this screen, it's pretty much it summarizes this data much better than what's on these 4 tabs, right? So again, we're trying to improve that viewpoint and that overall view to allow you to see across multiple fabrics, not just one. So now essentially I can look across every fabric I'm responsible for and say, hey, which one has, which ones is the worst from a CAM perspective, or too many VLANs deployed, that kind of stuff. So you can do that at the very highest level. So that's a good overview of the high level statistics. So if we go back to the fabric health, let's dive in a level and let's look at a specific fabric. So in SevOne Data Insight, I have the ability to link other reports in. So I've selected this particular device, which is actually a fabric, and I want more detailed information. So this will take me to the fabric report, and the fabric report is going to focus on that one particular fabric, and it's going to allow me to look at a little bit more specific information. So again, we start right off with, well, what's the health of the fabric? What's the health been over time? So this is another visualization that's built into DI that allows me to look at basically heat map over time. So I could make this longer and it would obviously adjust. So if there were changes in this, you would see the change in those things. And then down here, you can see, well, here's that fabric summary stuff we talked about before for this fabric alone, right? So that's here. Now I want to look at this specific tenant information for this specific thing. So this is similar to what you saw before, but it's zeroed in specifically on the tenants that are here. And we've added some more data, which is essentially tell me which tenants essentially have the most data transmit, right? So what's their ingress? Which ones have the most ingress transmit? So this gives you an example of, essentially I can select, and I can go in here now and I can say, well, let's start with the vCenter tenant, right? Let's look at him specifically. What's his data transmit? And you can see essentially the graphs will, because they're chained together, you'll essentially see health score and then how much the transmit is. So I'm looking specifically at that tenant. Again, I can drill down applications, do the same sort of view, because again, we want to talk tenants, we want to talk applications. So here's all the applications that are part of this tenant and their health scores. So same sort of view here. Let's go down one more level. So what are applications in ACI? Applications are basically relationships of communications between multiple groups of servers called endpoint groups. So an endpoint would be like a VM or a physical box. So endpoint groups are essentially how those are grouped together in ACI. So you got to have endpoint groups to have applications to have tenants, right? So there's a building block here. So endpoint groups can have health status just like, you know, anything else. So a good example of a bad health status for an EPG would be, hey, you know what? I don't have any more members. There's no more endpoints up in this group. Yeah, that would probably not be a great thing if, you know, if every endpoint in a particular group was down, and that group was, you know, let's say the web front ends for a 3-tiered database, a 3-tiered, you know, application, right? So again, we can, you know, we're collecting that data over time so we can see exactly what's happening. The other pieces at this level are not just the grouping, but also the communications. So there's really two different communications. Bridge domains essentially are, what are the communications, layer 2 based communications in the fabric, and the private networks are what are the layer 3 based. So if there's any issues with any of the layer 2 or layer 3 policies that are set up in communications, we would see that in health score information here. So another piece is, and this is where we get into the health score a little bit more, is health score is really determined and calculated based on the faults that are outstanding for a device from ACI. So essentially, we pull this data in from ACI. So this is a real-time display. So essentially, when I hit this, it went out and gathered this data. So I can look in real time and look at, here are all the faults that are related to this fabric. And there's different ways to sort them based on the domain that they're coming in, the types and that kind of thing. So this gives you, again, this is more, I'm trying to figure out if there's a problem, I see a low health score, let me go look at the faults that are available in that fabric that are maybe associated with that object, that kind of stuff. So again, we talked about
question on the fault, because I look at that as a great problem management dashboard. So with that being said, you're able to see all of the description. Now, what about adding in there? I know Cisco publishes the recommended actions. Do you capture that at all, or do you think that's able to be added? Or can you talk to me about that a little bit?
So everything that everything in the fault stuff is all based on the fault code.
Right.
So, you know, it would definitely be, if that was published somewhere, we could certainly link that to this fault code field, and
okay,
to basically tie that together. So that the key is, like, what do you do about a fault? You know, it's the fault.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah, because it's a published document. At least this BU for Cisco is actually doing it right.
yeah.
So it's a published document. So if I had a 532, it would actually assist whoever is looking at the problem management dashboard. Say, hey guys, this is your top talker for faults, and here's the action that you should take to resolve that. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
definitely can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, everything we do is based on faults, and then, you know, in Verizon, you know, we have the ability to essentially in the collector say, we want to generate SevOne alerts based on faults. So again, these are faults, these are real-time ones. But if I actually want to generate something that I want to keep in SevOne, and again, in Verizon, the implementation is that your escalation systems come to SevOne to essentially gather faults that have been generated. So we pull the fault information. We actually subscribe to the faults, to a specific list of faults from ACI. We create SevOne alerts out of those faults. There's none in here now, but so we would do that, and then essentially you have automation that will come along and then pick up those faults and then move them to your escalation system. So right. Yeah, build that linkage in either into this particular visualization, or we could do it directly off of linking the field from the alert itself. So
I appreciate it.
yep. So all right. So again, we talked about the leaf capacity. Now we're just sort of zeroed down to that one level. But let me get to the more fun stuff here. So this is where we talked about that going from physical to logical. And this is a visualization that was built specifically for ACI, which is, okay, I don't really, maybe I come in here, I'm looking for a particular IP address or something like that. So let's do the all here. So now I have the ability to be able to say, I want to find, I have an endpoint that is a specific IP address. I want to find that specific IP, and I want to see essentially, here's the logical side, and then where is it physically connected into the fabric, what leaf switch and what switch port, right? And what VLAN is in use. So this is really powerful. And then in the center here, if your environment, and this may or may not be the case, if you are application centric, AKA you have the customer has a hypervisor, could be VMware, could be other, there's a couple different hypervisors that ACI supports. We can fill that information in. We get that information from the controller that basically says, oh, this is the controller that is basically running that resource, and it's in this particular domain and provider, et cetera. So we get a lot of that information here. So we find this is a really powerful view the customers like, because essentially they can drill down and say, you know what, we're going to have to do some work on leaf 2. Let's see all this. If I touch leaf 2, what tenants and applications am I going to impact that are running right now? So that's pretty nice. You can actually do that pretty quickly. We're assembling that data from what we get from from the controller, or I want to look at a specific switch port. So this is one of those things where I talk about solutions where it's like we custom built a widget, a data widget in DI that this is just to process data that comes in from ACI, because we have this very special use case of being able to do that. Of course, here I can go in and say, if I want to find a particular endpoint, I can find it by IP or by name. So we built in a bunch of, there's a fuzzy search here versus being able to select things. So this gives you really good understanding of, the logical side to the physical side of things. Because again, what are you usually starting with? Hey, I've got a problem on an endpoint. This is the IP address. Okay, let me go find out where that is in this world of ACI, right? The other side of this one is, and this is the graphical side. So what I showed you before was essentially, that was the tabular view. This is the graphical view, right? So now I can, show the relationship, tenant, application, EPG, endpoints, right? So now, and again, I can do all that level of filtering and looking for specific things in this view as well. So these are some visualizations we built to make it easier to understand, essentially how stuff is connected, and then what the state is here too. So we can change how things are organized by status and things like that. So that's an overview of the fabric. Wanted to move on to, let's look at let's go back to the switches. So maybe I just care about one switch. So let's take a look at this leaf 2 switch. We have a report specifically looking at the switch. So if you're familiar with, our out of the box DI reports, this looks a lot like the switch report for the out of the box. It's not exactly the same. So here's a graphical representation or a topology view 2 hops that basically shows, hey, leaf 2, he's got an APIC connected to him. He's connected he's on this fabric. He's connected to the spine, which is connected to another leaf, etc. Here's his health score. Here's some interesting information about basically his, what's his firmware, out of band IPs, model numbers, etc. All that stuff we're storing as metadata. Let's look at his health over time. Again, we have our visualizations there, but we can dig a little deeper. How about kernel CPU? What's it look like? Has it changed over time? What's the baseline? What's 2 standard deviations away? So that's kernel CPU, user CPU. Memory utilization, again, if things spike up, we can see that. It's pretty flatlined here. And we get into operational status. So what's interesting about ACI is that, so this is operational status, right? Which is sort of your indicator of like, is it working or not? Sort of the top level. So our initial, when we built this originally, you know, we go with the concept of admin status, operational status. The admin and op status are up, everything's good, should be working. So this is sort of an overview in this switch, which ones of these ports have an op status, what's their op status, either up or down. Now you notice it's done as a number here. So in the NMS, we store time series data. I want to be able to see over time if this has changed. So I have to store it as an integer. In ACI, when that data comes from them, they essentially say 1 is up and 2, or 1 is down and 2 is up. Well, maybe that's different than what we're traditionally used to from SNMP, where it's a different set of values. It's 0 and 1 is up and down, right? So it's a little confusing from the first part, right? So again, point here is I want to be able to see what the current value is. I've also added in this cool little field that says, well, what's the usage of this? So this is part of what we discover with ACI is what's the usage of this port from a policy perspective? Is it an EPG? You know, is their controller supposed to be there? That kind of stuff. So we've expanded this quite a bit in the latest release based on requests from Verizon. So let's take a look at this port. No, actually, I'm going to go here first. Let's do this. Okay, so let's take a look at what is potentially the new version of the operational status dashboard, right? So I have my ports. I have my last value. Oh yeah, I have the translation now in English. This is actually a metadata value, right? So I can see up, down. You don't have to know that. Let's throw admin status up there. Well, they're all admin up. Oh, wait, what's this switching state? Well, it turns out that there's this extra thing in ACI called switching state. And switching state is essentially saying, are the policies set up to allow this traffic to flow to this port? So it's a software defined thing. It's not admin or opera status. So you can have admin up, opera up, but switching state can be disabled because there's no policy configured to utilize to use that port. So essentially, it's a metric that we didn't collect before. Now we're collecting and being able to show over time. So, you know, you take, for example, this port, it's like up, you know, admin status is up, but his switching state is down, right? So if he was up, you know, so really this one you would have to say, okay, there's a policy issue here. If this port, why is this port not used? It's based on the way that it's configured, right? So the other thing that can happen is that you could be opera status down, admin status up, because you need a fiber channel, fiber channel device. So we're also collecting all of the, basically, is there a fiber channel connector on this device for things that are fiber channel based? And then all the information about that. So this gives you a better overview of what's going on with, you know, the interfaces and the ports and what they do and that kind of stuff. So, and then, you know, the other thing is, let's look at, you know, the throughput of the interfaces, obviously, you know, which interface is using the most ingress and egress over time, that kind of stuff. So let's drill one level deeper on this guy. I want to know everything that you can tell me about this port. And this is a lot of the stuff that we added before. So on the left-hand side is all that metadata. Metadata is English, like I can read it, you know, it's meant for humans to read, right? It's not time series. These values can change and they will change over time, but they're human readable. The stuff on the right is the indicators. So again, these are numeric values that are getting updated, you know, by the collector on a periodic basis. You know, so they have a maximum value, they're going to change over time, that kind of stuff. So you can see that some of the values on the right-hand side are being stored as indicator, like that switching state. Okay, it's a 1, but over here I got enabled, right? So again, we're providing you with sort of the, hey, we're able to track this over time, so you can look at this metric over time to see when it's changed, but then also understand, well, what's the current, what is it right now? And that's really what the metadata provides, is that view. And then we've added some other interesting things in here based on requests from James about that fiber channel connector, like what's a serial number, what's the state, what type of connector is it? You know, those kinds of things are important to understand as part of this as well, because it's key to that. And then from a capacity perspective on the port, what's the capability of this port? Right now, the way the port's configured, it can do, you know, 1G or 10G, right? I have ports that are 40G capable. How many 40G capable ports do I have? I don't know, but I can tell you this one is that, right? So now that we've gathered that information, now you can do reports and build reports based on and say, tell me how many 40G ports are enabled, that kind of stuff. So this is a little, again, a little delve into, you know, everything that we're collecting at the interface level for ACI. A lot of stuff there. So I will end with talking about, so we talked about switches, interfaces. Okay, so again, if I just, we'll start at the tenant and I'm going to stop here. So again, from a tenant perspective, what do the software defined components have? Well, they have health, they have fault counts, like how many faults are related and what types of faults, and then they have transmit and receive rates. So at every level here, you can look at whether it's tenant, application, EPG, I can look at transmit and receive data at every level here. So I can figure out what specific application group is transmitting, receiving, is it getting data, that kind of stuff. And then of course I can project based on that into the future. I can look at the baselines, I can do interesting stuff like that. So this is, again, we're delving more into the software defined side, looking at specific stuff, and I can pull that back. The last piece that I wanted to review today, so I've got, you know, again, there's different reports for each one of those. So the last piece I wanted to review today was the workspaces, which I call sort of the exploratory side of this, right? So I want to find stuff, I want to see what's going on, but I'm not really sure what I'm looking for. So we provide with this, you know, all these different top end sort of views. You may not even know that we have all this stuff in here. So this is sort of like opening up and saying, well, these are all the things that we're doing top end data on, like, you know, idle CPU on switches. And so maybe you want to look at some of this data based on that. Maybe you want to look at a particular object and you want to look at everything that we have for that particular object. And then what's the data look like over time? So this is sort of what we were looking at before. So like for this guy, I have a counter of faults, I have the number of bytes transmitted, I have multicast, I have unicast, I have all this different data that I'm collecting on that. So again, it's more of an exploratory view. And the last one is the object group workspace, I think was the one I wanted. Yeah. So this one, and this is one we're working on, is like, okay, I'm looking at a specific ACI tenant. I want to know everything about this tenant and this tenant only. So good example here is this is our vCenter, you know, lab environment, right? So I only care about what's happening with it. So how many faults, the unicast and the multicast transmitted, and then only show me information about the application profiles associated with that tenant, right? And then the endpoint groups that are associated just to that tenant. So these are all the things that are associated. So again, more of an exploratory kind of view if I'm really drilled in and looking at a very specific application or tenant, and I want to find out what's going on within that. And then down to the very last part, which is like, show me every blessed thing that we're collecting about this particular, so we got bridge domains, I got application profiles, I got EPGs, I got endpoints, so all sorts of things. So I said, these are intended to be more exploratory. Maybe you see some data in here and then you can build a report that you want to build on top of it, based on what you found in here and say, oh, I didn't know you had endpoints in there. Can I build a report around the endpoints? Yeah, we can do that. So, but this gives you a little bit more flexibility on, looking at the data that's actually being collected.